Okay, welcome. My name's Ken Johnson, and this is our 15th Time4Action webinar this late winter and spring. My colleagues Kathleen O'Hara, Rolly Montpellier, and I are coming to you from the traditional lands of the Algonquin peoples. Today we have what we think will be a more controversial webinar than usual. We've got two excellent guests who want to see the NDP and the Green parties cooperate during the next federal election to get way more seats. Sounds like a good idea to me. Rae Perfitt has been a community organizer with 350.org. And of course, you know that 350 is the international movement founded by heroic activist and author Bill McKibbon and others to end fossil fuels and build a world of community-led renewable energy for all. Katie first got involved with the climate movement during her time in Halifax with Divest Dal, a fossil fuel divestment campaign at Dalhousie University. Since then, she's been involved in anti-fracking and anti-pipeline work across Turtle Island and supports the participation of young people in the fight to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So we're very happy to have her. We haven't had so many young people, but this is a great opportunity to have one that I know who's a great mover and shaker. I've done many things with her. The other guest is Rael Laverne. He's the One-Time Alliance. He's from the One-Time Alliance for Democratic Reform. He is also president of Fair Vote Canada, which advocates for electoral reform and proportional representation. But to be clear here, this initiative is not part of the Fair Vote Canada operation. However, he's here representing the Alliance only. He's an economist and a political economist with a PhD from the University of Toronto. His professional experience includes working as a researcher for the North-South Institute, an associate professor at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, developing and supporting research and projects in Africa and Latin America with the International Development Research Center, IDRC, and as a senior policy analyst with the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, all before retiring and becoming a democracy activist. So as usual today, we'll start with Kathleen interviewing our two guests for about 30 minutes. Then I'll probably ask some follow-up questions, and then we'll throw it open to you out there, and Rolly will ask some questions from the audience. Please put your questions in the Q&A if you'd like, and we'll hope we can get to all of them. Okay, over to you, Kathleen. Looking forward to the session.
Thanks, Ken, and welcome to our viewers and our wonderful guests. Gutsy guests, I'd say, taking on a big challenge, but I think we'll get there. You both advocate a one-time alliance for the next election, whenever that will be. Why now? I mean, why this election? Katie?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm tuning in from Lanark County as well as a bunch of the guests, which I'm really excited about. So I'm in Pakenham, which is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And yeah, why a one-time alliance? The international panel, the IPCC has told us that we have basically a decade to take the kind of action we need to take, the drastic action we need to take to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And that means that whoever is elected in the next election has 4 years, basically half of that time, to govern, to ensure or not that we push forward the kind of climate policy we need. That's a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity. And we know that if left to the status quo of our political system being so broken, that we could end up with 4 more years of denial and delay that the Trudeau government has proven is their track record, or even worse, you know, for 4 years of absolute denial from the Conservative government. So we're calling for a one-time alliance in this upcoming election because of the unique challenge that climate change poses to us. We have a closing window, and we believe that by electing the most Greens and NDP possible to the House of Commons gives us the best shot at passing the kind of climate legislation we need to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So in a nutshell, that's why.
Thanks, Katie. Rael, why now?
I think that summarizes it very nicely. The future of the planet is at stake. We have 10 years to go, and we have an electoral system that just doesn't seem to manage to elect the progressive candidates that we need to push that agenda forward. So if we want to do some quickly, the one thing we can do quickly is try to elect more progressive candidates from the NDP and the Greens. And I think when it comes to climate change, we have to say mainly the Greens, but I think if the Greens were there in greater numbers, that the NDP and the NDP was there in greater numbers, that together they could apply a lot of pressure. The last thing we want in the next election, whenever it is another Liberal majority. No, the last thing we want would be a Conservative majority, but second last would be another Liberal majority where they can just do what they want and continue to just pass the buck, which is what they've been doing. Now, I'm a little bit optimistic that they're going to do better, but I'm not optimistic that they'll do good enough without more political pressure from the Greens and the NDP. I will say that perhaps just to add one thing is the people who are in the one-time alliance tend to be very much electoral reformers. So for us, that's a big agenda, but that's not more urgent this year than it was last year. I mean, that's been urgent for the last 100 years. Nonetheless, at the same time, if we're pursuing to elect more NDP and Greens, it will really help to pursue the electoral reform agenda as well.
Rael, can you tell us how it would work, basically? Very basically. We'll get into the details later, but.
Well, the basic idea is in the word alliance. This is about the parties, or maybe at the EDA level or at the highest level, but normally alliances are done at the highest level in order to run a reduced number of candidates. So in key ridings, you would run a Green. In other key ridings, you would run an NDP candidate. And the idea would be that you would increase the likelihood of those candidates being elected. This is done in other countries. I've been studying the experience of Chile lately because they've been doing alliances for over 100 years. They always have like about 20 parties running, but the parties themselves run in alliances, and there's arrangements that are made so that each party can win seats. It's typical in France as well. And in the UK, they tried that in the last election as well, but it was just the really tiny parties that participated. So there's a limit to how much they can do. In France and Chile, it's a really big deal.
Katie, can you give us a basic idea of
Yeah,
how it would work?
Sure. So our with the Climate Emergency Alliance campaign that we've just launched, which you can find at climatealliance.ca, similarly to the one-time alliance folks, we see there's kind of like different ways this could play out, whether at the riding level or at a national level. For our team, what we believe is that the most powerful and impactful version of this alliance would be the party leaders, Annamie and Jagmeet Singh, coming together to commit to working across party lines in Parliament and during the election to elect as many climate champions as possible. And what this would look like is in ridings where one party has a chance of winning and the other is sitting in third or fourth place, that means the trailing candidate would actually stand down and throw their support behind the other, all under the banner of the Climate Emergency Alliance. So in ridings where the NDP and the Green candidates are running in first and second, that's actually amazing. And that can be the place where we see those parties actually running kind of climate primary, where the parties are running vigorous campaigns against one another that challenge each other to be bolder on climate and other policies that are in line with a Green New Deal. So we think that that approach can do a couple of things that are really critical. One is that that actually really shines a light on this problem that while Trudeau says he's a leader on climate, he actually hasn't proven that in any of his actions. And by having the two parties, the Greens and the NDP, saying we're in a crisis and our political system and the status quo is not okay, that's actually shining a huge light on the failure of the Liberal government, which is what we need to dispel the myth that Trudeau is a climate champion. And then the other thing that it would do would be that it would see many, many more climate champions actually in the House of Commons going to bat for the climate policy that we need. Like, it would actually see the increase in the amount of potential climate leaders that we actually have elected, which is essential if we're going to see climate policy moved at a federal level.
Thanks. Rael, how does this differ from strategic voting? I mean, why not just stick with that concept?
Strategic voting is what happens right now. You got people voting strategically for the Liberals instead of voting for the Greens and the NDP because they think the Liberals are necessary to keep the Conservatives from winning. So that's the fundamental problem with our system. In an alliance, what an alliance tries to do is it tries to accommodate to the existing rules of the game and kind of circumvent the problems that that system involves. And that's not just about voters choosing to vote strategically, which is not to the advantage of the Greens and the NDP normally. We'll talk later about a backup plan that 350.org and we have in store if we can't get support from the leaders. But the basic idea is a formal alliance between the two parties that would be fair to both parties. And that's very different from just strategic voting.
Katie, anything to say about strategic voting, the difference?
I mean, yeah, what Rael said is very on point. I would just add that most people in Canada agree that climate change is a problem and that we need to do drastic things to ensure that we meet climate targets. And at a riding level, it's really challenging for people to actually vote strategically if there isn't a campaign that's clearly pointing them in the right direction that has a clear strategy behind it. And just want to point out that if you go to climatealliance.ca, you can read the case that we made for the Climate Emergency Alliance, which in it outlines a number of ridings where this strategy and this approach would actually be very strong. It would require really strong local campaigns, but that would help elect and put into play way more seats than otherwise if the campaign didn't exist. So it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy for every riding, but it does allow us to hone in on ridings where it really could change the game and give voters who care about climate a real option for who they should vote for and why.
But there are
strategic. I think that's important to note that the word strategic still applies, but the strategy is to run one candidate in strategic key ridings. It's not just about getting voters to vote strategically for one or another.
And giving, at the same time, you're giving them some guidance. It would be more visible and more organized. I think it's a much better thing because people vote strategically just almost by instinct. They're desperately trying to stop the Tories or get rid of Harper. But there's one thing, the Green Party's constitution says that they have to run a candidate in every riding. There's one hurdle. What do we do about that, Rael?
That is a major hurdle. It's one that can be solved, and I think we will eventually solve it. I hope they will. I mean, it's the Greens, so I should say they. But it is a major problem because as we try to negotiate at the riding level, at the EDA level, the Greens are unable to step back right now. They can't say we will step back. They could say, well, we'll run a ho-hum hologram campaign is an expression that's used a little bit in the business. I find it quite an interesting concept. But so long as the Greens can't make those concessions, then the NDP won't make it either. So those negotiations have been extremely difficult because of this rather odd constitutional requirement, which I have not seen anywhere. None of the other parties in Canada has it. So what the One Time Alliance has done, you need to know that the One Time Alliance is composed essentially of Green Party members and NDP party members, and a lot of us are actually members of both parties, even though we're not supposed to be. You can imagine, people who are interested in a one-time alliance are people who have a foot in each party in one way or another. So the Green Party members of the one-time alliance actually put together a resolution for the upcoming online convention that the Greens are planning. That resolution will be debated, it will be discussed. And so it's quite possible that between now and when there's an election, that problem will have been removed. And there's quite a bit of support within the Green Party for that. We got 95 signatures for that resolution. We only needed 20. And then I've heard support from fairly senior people in the Green Party as well, that they think there are good reasons to remove that clause.
Katie, have you been looking at that particular barrier?
Yeah, and it's definitely a question that we've received quite a bit from people texting in who understand the Green Green Party conventions. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that we've been saying is just because it's in a constitution doesn't mean it can't be changed. And yeah, just hands up to the One Time Alliance folks who have been pushing this. And yeah, I think I would just say there's two things that I want to add to this is for a party like the Greens, it is actually very strategic for them to focus their resources towards ridings where they have a higher chance of winning, as opposed to spreading themselves thin in all ridings. They actually would probably do a lot better if they could really concentrate their efforts. So I think that is one thing that I personally think about in terms of this strategy. The other piece that I want to say too is that I'm really looking forward to seeing the Green Party be the first to move towards this alliance. And I say that because I actually think that Annamie Paul making a challenge to Jagmeet Singh could be the way that we actually see the NDP move on this strategy. I think Annamie Paul could make a very compelling case. And I want to clarify all of this by saying for 350 Canada, we come at this from a place of being a really movement oriented organization. So what we're trying to do and what we understand is that most people in Canada are not hardened in their party politics. They go into elections thinking, who is the best person at a local level that will represent me, while also looking at federal level dynamics. And so for us, we're really trying to resonate with that broader public that doesn't have those hardened party politics, but want to make a smart choice in the upcoming election about the climate. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add that as context. And I saw in the chat, like, what is the difference between the two organizations? That's a huge one, is that, One Time Alliance really comes from within the Green Party as such an important movement to push that party, but also, push the conversation writ large. Whereas we're really coming from a place of most people are having a really hard time figuring out how to strategically place their vote. So yeah, just wanted to clarify that.
Well, that was actually a good question. I should have asked it. Rael, I saw in the Globe and Mail, Brad Levine, one of the movers and shakers of the NDP, is saying, if we do it right, we can have another orange wave, another Jack Layton style orange wave. So they seem to be getting pumped. I don't know on what basis, frankly, but there's another barrier. If they think that the orange wave is ready and able to come again, will they cooperate? Rael?
Yeah, I haven't seen that article. Is that just today, Kathleen?
No, it was a couple of days ago.
A couple of days ago? I'm going to look for it.
In the Globe and Mail.
Yep,
Anyway,
I'm
basically,
a subscriber, so I'll be able to find it. I'll have a look at it.
Yeah.
I do think that's a challenge. I look at Jagmeet in the media, and he really seems to be coming into his own, I must say. He's a compelling speaker, comes across as very affable. And it may well be that the NDP think, oh, we can do this on our own. We don't need the Greens. We would argue, well, great if you could do a lot on your own, but you could do better in collaboration with the Greens as well. And depending on the ridings, we have picked ridings where the Greens currently, we'll be talking about this later, I know, we've picked ridings where the Greens have a pretty significant presence already, and where therefore collaboration with the Greens could make a difference. We're not looking at, ridings like Windsor-Tecumseh or Ottawa-Vanier, where the Greens are only picking up 3 or 4 or 5%. We're looking at ridings where the Greens have been picking up 9 to 12%. And that could make a big difference. So God bless the NDP if they think they can have another orange wave. That'd be fantastic. But that doesn't mean that the idea of collaboration should be off the table.
Katie, could you respond to that? The orange wave.
This is so interesting. So we've actually found through the research that we did to create the case document that because of the NDP's position on climate in both Alberta and in BC, but also just like the lack of really forward leadership on climate at a federal level, that NDP is actually missing out on a whole bunch of votes. And so I tend to agree that I think the NDP have a lot to learn from both the climate movement and the ways that the climate movement is intersecting with other social movements in Canada, but also the Green Party in terms of how to put forward ambitious climate policy. And I think I would flip this on its head too, because, and I want to put a challenge to Green Party supporters, especially ones who are really hardened in their partisanship, is that having the best climate targets is amazing, but it's not going to matter if you can't win seats. And so I'm putting this back on the Green Party as well, and the NDP, is that we don't have time to wait for your respective parties to gain enough political power to govern. We don't have time for that in the context of a climate emergency. And so it's actually the morally just thing to do, to think of in a very strategic way about how we can make sure that we elect as many climate champions as possible, understanding that those do actually exist within both parties. Like, we do know that within the NDP, there are firecracker MPs on climate. I'm thinking about Leah Gazan, Matthew Green, Laurel Collins. Like, there are people who are going to bat, and we need more people like that. So yeah, I actually think the NDP have a lot of, like, a long way to go in terms of where they are in climate. And I think the Greens are really well positioned to push them on that.
I guess you need to tell the leaders, the Brad Levines of the world, that they're more likely to have an orange wave with the Alliance.
Would I be able to
Sorry.
share my screen quickly? I think this is a really compelling visual for participants. I think I'm able to. I just want to, like, drive home how significant this, I'm going to call it climate champion wave, could be. If just in the writings that we've identified through our case document, currently between the Greens and the NDP, there's about 31 seats that are competitive without a climate emergency alliance. If this strategy was embraced in full, a whole 108 seats would be put into play. This doesn't mean they would be given for either of those parties, but it does mean that with a strong climate forward campaign that is rooted in social justice, that is reflective of this strategy, if that is in play at a local level and voters are, like, clearly driven to the candidate that is endorsed through this campaign, 108 seats could be put in play. And that totally changes the balance of power in the House of Commons. So I just want to, like, emphasize, I can't emphasize this enough, that this strategy is both strategic for the Greens and for the NDP, because it means their seat counts increase significantly.
That's pretty compelling. I mean, I just don't see how the NDP, especially when they haven't been polling that well, how they could say no. I mean, you've got a great offer for them. Rae, you've done some modeling as well, haven't you?
Yes, I have. And the interesting thing about the modeling that we've done, and 350 Canada comes to the same conclusion, is that, in fact, the NDP comes off a far bigger winner from collaboration than the Green Party does. In our simulations, we have different scenarios. We have a pessimistic scenario, a middle of the road scenario, and an optimistic scenario. And of course, we want to blue sky this, so we tend to look more at the optimistic one. We're trying to see, well, what would be possible? And according to our calculations of what would be possible, we could see under the optimistic scenario 32 extra wins, plus holding some of the seats that otherwise might be threatened. But new seats, 32 seats. Out of that, all but 4, so 28 new seats would be taken by the NDP, and 4 new seats would be taken by the Greens. And the reason, of course, is the NDP is a much larger party, and there are a lot more ridings that, when you crunch the numbers, come out as winnable for the NDP. And so the interest of the NDP should not just be to have an alliance and win a lot more seats, but to have an alliance that covers as many seats as possible. And if you were strategic from the Greens, you'd have the same objective if you cared about both parties together. But if you just cared about the Greens, you'd say, well, why don't we just focus on 4 seats each, let's say, or 5 seats each, something in a small alliance, right? So it's very interesting, this distinction between the intrinsic negotiating interests of the 2 parties and where they would meet in the middle somewhere. I don't know where that would be, but it's inconceivable that it blows the mind that it's the NDP that's the most resistant to collaboration. And I'm sure Katie would agree with me. That's where the problem lies, not with the Greens. You're muted, Kathleen.
Yeah. Every question. There's something rattling about my stand. Anyway, blame Amazon. I was just wondering if you've dealt with any of the higher ups in either of the parties. Katie, have you approached them?
Yeah, so we've definitely approached them, and I'm sure Riel, like your team, has more direct conversation with both parties. But what Riel is saying tracks. We haven't yet heard a response from the higher ups in the NDP. We have heard that Annamie Paul is seeing the campaign, and so I think, like, in the lead up to the upcoming convention is when it's going to be really important for us to continue building popular support for this idea and putting pressure on both the party leaders. Like, I think those 2 tracks we need to continue down this path on. One of the things that we're going to be doing over the course of the summer in our campaign is really escalating the pressure on both parties, and in particular doing that through the donation drives for each of those parties. So I'm very excited for all of you who are on this call to sign up and to sign up at climatealliance.ca to get involved with all of the really fun, like, digital tactics that we're going to be doing to ensure that through every channel, whether they're texting you, emailing you, giving you a phone call, that both parties are hearing loud and clear that people are not going to support these parties with their bucks unless they actually think strategically about how they're going to come together in a climate alliance. So very excited to get all of you involved in that.
When is the Green convention? The Green Party convention?
I think it's still being scheduled. Is that right, Riel?
Oh,
The
okay.
dates are still not firm on that.
Okay.
I'd like to lead by example, Katie, on what you just said about the financing, and then I'd like to talk about the conversations with leaders. But just to lead on what you're saying about the financing, you'd be pleased to know that I canceled my monthly contributions to the NDP, saying that I was now going to use those funds strategically in ridings of my choice. So I'm hoping that a lot of people will do that. They eventually will get the message. With regards now to meetings with the leaders, I've been blessed by the openness of the Green Party leaders to talk about this. In fact, I talked to Annamie Paul about it during the leadership race, and I've exchanged with Elizabeth May quite a bit on this. I know Elizabeth May well from my work as president of Fair Vote Canada, and other leaders, leadership contenders have spoken to us. Joanne Roberts has spoken to us as well. What I get from all of those is a sort of openness, but a deep mistrust and a fear of getting burnt. So that's what I get from the Green Party side. On the NDP side, it's basically crickets. They won't talk to us. We've been asking for meetings on Zoom with Anne McGrath, with Jagmeet Singh, or anybody who'll talk to us. And at the leadership level, it's very hard to reach anybody at all. So that's the difference there. Very early on, when we first launched our first press release, that was back in September, October 2020. We launched our press release at that time, and CBC did a piece on the idea of a one-time alliance. And they interviewed both Charlie Angus and Jagmeet Singh at that time. And what came back at that time was basically ridicule of the idea. We then wrote to both of them. A lot of people wrote to them and wrote a lot of letters, and I think it was compelling. And they went quiet after that. But so the new strategy seems to be to basically just try to ignore us.
Well, maybe, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, maybe they might not be able to ignore the canceled checks or the lack of money coming in. I mean, money talks, especially before an election. I'm going to turn it over to Ken. He has some questions for you. And then, as I said, or as Ken said, we'll go to audience questions and comments. I think Rolly and Ken might read some comments too, because this is quite a debate and we might as well have it out in the open. So over to you, Ken, and thank you both very much.
Thanks, Kathleen. Rial, the first question I'd like to ask you is just a continuation from what you were saying. If you can't get the cooperation of the leadership, how do you envision it playing out and what's possible?
Well, and I'm sure Katie will have some interesting things to say about that as well, because Katie has basically laid it out already. If we can't get the support of the leaders in this election, we're hoping it'll be the election after that, because they won't win the seats that they need, and you know, they'll have to make some corrections. What we would be doing then is focusing on a smaller number of ridings where we can have some impact, and hopefully getting other organizations. There's Courage, possibly Lead Now, of course, 350 Canada, maybe Faribault Canada, to all do the same thing, which is to encourage people in riding X to support the Green or the NDP, depending who's been assigned that riding, to endorse that candidate, and to try to channel resources to that one candidate as much as possible and channel voters. So some people have said it sounds like a strategic voting strategy, but it's not just strategic voting. It's also strategic allocation of civil society resources. And civil society resources can be substantial. We can mobilize, I think Canada, 350 Canada can mobilize 100,000 people. Faribault Canada can mobilize about 30,000 people. Those kinds of organizations can mobilize a lot of people if they're willing to be part of this. It doesn't have to be the parties that make up all the rules.
Katie, you want to add anything to that?
Just like trying not to like twinkle my fingers. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Parties follow where people are at, and I think the best thing we can do right now is to have conversations about this with as many people as possible. We know that the vast majority of people in Canada care about the climate and want to see politicians do something about it. So don't be afraid to have those conversations. We're encouraging people to text, email, call, Facebook message, tweet at people in your community who you think would be open to this idea. So send them the link to our website, One Time Alliance website. Let people know about this. And that's the best thing we can do, especially right now when we don't actually know when the election's going to be. And then the other thing I want to point to is for anyone who is following 350 Canada's work during the last federal election in 2019, we were mobilizing young voters to support Green New Deal champions. And one of the things that we did was we held open nomination processes for young people to be able to nominate local level leaders who are running. It all ended up being NDP and Greens candidates who were nominated. And so they nominated these Green New Deal champions, and they would do that after having talked to the candidate, followed their social media, how they were performing in debates. And they nominated these people, and then we actually did a process of filtering that through criteria that we had created with a council of young people from across the country to make sure that every single person we endorsed ended up really reflecting some key pillars of what a climate champion, a real climate champion would be. And then we released those endorsements, and in ridings where we had endorsed candidates would drive people, and like a lot of young people, towards those candidate campaigns to make sure that those people were elected. And what ended up happening was we had a slate of Green New Deal champions that ended up being elected into the House of Commons. People like Matthew Green, like Laurel Collins. There was also Elizabeth May, of course. There was and a bunch of others. So they were all elected into the House of Commons, and now you see those folks voting together on different pieces of legislation, including I think it's C-232 that is League of Lands Bill. So when we're thinking about the upcoming election in terms of our strategy, is we're really going to be not only looking at the numbers, but also who are the people actually running, and then making a decision about who are the people we're going to endorse in these ridings.
Great, thank you, Katie. I think a lot of people in the audience, if they haven't looked closely at this, they're wondering, well, what ridings? Are they talking about my riding? What's going on? Riel, I'm wondering whether you could just take us through maybe the middle scenario and give it a little more substance as to what ridings are we talking about? What are the circumstances in those ridings, and how optimistic you should be about how many seats you'd get?
Well, we've written recently to all of the EDAs. EDA is the Electoral District Association. So the EDAs of the Greens and the NDP in key ridings that we think are the most promising in terms of what collaboration can deliver. Our first letter was called the Top 16. So in that letter, we identified 9 and 7. 9 ridings for the NDP and 7 ridings for the Greens. So we think that, if in a small scenario, that's the one we'd pursue. If there's more ambition or to increase the menu, because after all, we want some of this to be coming from the bottom up. So if a riding who's not been included in our top 16 still wants to collaborate, we're not going to turn them down. So that's where the top 45 comes in. It allows us to have a larger shopping list of ridings where it might be possible to do something. The top 16, to give you some of the examples of the ridings that are in there, our number 1 is also one of the number 1s for 350 Canada is Burnaby North. Burnaby North Seymour. That one is slated for the NDP. It was a very, very close riding in the last election. The Greens took 9.45% of the vote to the NDP's 32. You add those two up together and you've got a clear win. So that's our number 1 on the NDP side. But I can give you some other examples. Halifax, Davenport, Yukon, and Kootenay, Columbia. So just to give you maybe those 4 out of the top 9. And on the Green side, number 1 is Toronto Centre with Annamie Paul, obviously. West Van, where they did very well last time, came in 2nd. Kitchener Centre, they came in 2nd last time as well. Guelph, they came in 2nd, and Malpeque, they came in 2nd. So those are the top 5 for the Greens. In all of those cases, the NDP took a substantial enough share of the vote as to make a difference. We're looking at mainly in the order of 12 to 17% that the NDP took last time, and the Green portion being larger in all of those cases. If you look at the average of the top 16, the Greens took 9% of the vote in the 9 NDP slated ridings, and the NDP took 12% of the vote in the Green slated ridings. So you can see the amount of votes that there are out there to be gotten by concentrating the vote on one side or the other is significant. And that's a major criteria for us. We're not just looking at winnable ridings like Windsor-Tecumseh, which the NDP can win on their own and the Greens only got 3%. That's just not interesting. But these are the interesting ridings.
I think when in the party's beginnings, like the Green Party's beginnings, it made a lot of sense to try to have someone run in every riding where they're really trying to put themselves on the map. And I think, I think we're just not in that scenario anymore. I think there are pockets of the country that are really on track to support the Green Party and to really concentrate their efforts there. So they have more people in the House of Commons. They can increase their visibility, and then maybe in the future go back to a place of running candidates in more ridings. But where it stands right now with the and where the party's at, to concentrate their financial resources, their personnel resources to ridings where they stand a better chance, just means that they're more likely to elect people in those ridings, as opposed to dispersing resources in ridings where they don't really stand a chance. And I think, to me, there is a piece of this that I know, because these parties, and especially more grassroots oriented parties like the Green Party and the NDP Party, is that there is an element where you're telling people at a local level who have probably put in a lot of volunteer time that that you're going to choose strategy over that historic effort. And that's probably not going to feel good. But I think we need to put our partisanship and our passion for the party in second place to strategy. And I'll just keep saying that until I'm blue in the face. We don't have the luxury of putting our passion and our party politics to the center. Not right now. We have to be thinking strategically. So I think I'll just keep saying that until the end of time.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, we have a climate emergency and we have governments that aren't acting on it. So of course we need it right now. And I think it really is a test. The other thing that Cam Fenton of 350 wrote an article talking about the other thing that such an alliance would do besides winning more seats would be, it would really put a focus on the climate issue, because there's a high acceptance ratings of what the Liberals are doing, even though we know very well from our earlier webinars that they simply aren't coming close to doing what needs to be done. And maybe you could just talk briefly about that, put that lens on it.
Yeah, I love what Seth Klein talks about in his new book, and I know you've had him as a speaker on this series, of the new climate denialism, where someone comes off as if they're a climate leader, but does things like buys a pipeline, has emissions targets that are well below what is our fair share domestically. I mean, I could go on about, not introducing a Just Transition Act when we're clearly signaling that we're moving away from fossil fuels. All of these things are just like secretly undermining our ability to actually do what's necessary on climate. And so, I think what Seth Klein says about this new climate denialism is, maybe Trudeau isn't doing what the Conservative Party did, which was they can't even agree that climate change is a man-made issue that is real. But they are not doing what is necessary, but talking the talk like they are. And I think what this has done is it's really confused the public. It's a really cynical political strategy of confusing the public about what it actually means for us to take the kind of action that science and justice demand. And I think that really comes through in what we've been talking about in terms of the fact that most Canadians and people living in Canada believe the climate crisis is a crisis and we need to do something about it, but think Trudeau is doing okay. I also want to say too, and going back to what Riel was saying, and this highlights this kind of disconnect as well, is that a lot of people who voted for the Liberals in the last federal election, like I'm talking like 45%, considered voting NDP or Green, but worried about a Conservative possibly taking their riding, or having a Conservative government at play. And so I think this goes back to it as well, is like, I think people are scared voting for the Liberals instead of like having that strategic option at a local level that actually like is a reflection of like a courageous vote of shaking up party establishment. So that's a little bit of a disjointed answer, but I just think that like cynical politics of climate denialism is really hurting us, and this is a way we can actually meet it head on.
Thank you, Katie. Rael, I'd like you to pick up on what Katie was saying about the strategic voting that people are doing now, and how having this alliance, you talk about in some of your documentation, how having this alliance could cut into that. Oh, I feel like even though I'd like to vote Green or NDP, I have to vote for the Liberal.
Yes.
Like, maybe you could address that, because I think it's also a compelling argument where you could raise the vote for Greens and NDP by 10 or 15% if it's done right.
Yeah, well, that's the central argument behind our optimistic scenario, Ken. If you look at second preferences in the polls, you see that the second preferences of NDP voters are just as often to the Liberals as to the Greens. But what would happen if, part of that reason is for strategic reasons, that people are going to vote Liberal because they think the Liberals have more of a chance to win. So those second preference polls don't tell us very much. If we get the Greens and the NDP working together and people believe that those candidates actually have a chance, then the strategic vote could actually go towards those parties rather than away from them. And you could also get a lot of young people who don't bother to vote right now because their vote doesn't count. All of a sudden they say, oh, look at that. We could actually elect a progressive candidate in this riding. Let's get out and vote. So the voter turnout could go up as well. So anything can happen. And our simulations can't show that. And, except to say, well, this is our optimistic scenario. If anything can happen, this could happen. So I think that's really, really fundamental. And on our website, where we have this question about, can we really count on the NDP vote going to the Green candidate when there's no NDP candidate and vice versa? That's the essential answer. It's not about your second preferences. It's about creating some momentum. And then on the basis of that momentum, people realizing they actually have an alternative to the Liberals and the Conservatives. And you could see Liberal and Conservative ridings going towards the Alliance candidate, conceivably.
Just one last question, then I'll turn it over to Rolly. There was a concern raised that, well, the NDP aren't really very real climate champions. Jagmeet's been very quiet since 2019, since they were elected. They certainly talked about it a lot during the election campaign, but since then, they have been nowhere to be seen. And so I think it's a Green person was suggesting, well, why would we vote for the NDP? They don't even represent, they aren't even Green. Of course, you got BC and what happened with Nautney in Alberta. Anyway, maybe you'd like to address that.
You're addressing that one to me?
Yep.
I was hoping Katie could handle that hot potato.
Well, I could throw it over.
No, it's true. In the convention, we didn't hear very much about the climate crisis. There were quite a few resolutions, but the ones that passed were, kind of middle of the road, pragmatic kinds of resolutions. But I would think that the NDP running in alliance with the Greens would have to up its game in order to make that work. And I think, as Katie was also saying, the NDP has to up its game in general, with the climate issue being what it is. And I would expect that they are going to do that before very long. Right now, they're focusing on social justice issues, I think largely because of COVID. COVID creates opportunities to raise social justice issues and also draws greater attention to those social justice issues. So there's political capital to be won there. And I think that's where the NDP have been focusing. It doesn't mean it's the only issue that they're going to be going into the next election on. I hope anyway.
Thank you. Katie, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think going into this alliance, the Greens would actually have a lot of power to put some lines in the sand in terms of, like, this is what we expect the NDP's climate position to be if we're going to go into this alliance with you. So I think there's actually a lot of concessions the Greens could pull from the NDP if they do come to the table. And so, yeah, I think there's an opportunity for both parties to push each other in certain areas, which I think is amazing. I also I know that there is a lot of critique of the NDP, both at a provincial level and at a federal level. I don't think that should take away from the fact that just like the Greens, just like even the Liberal base, most people care a lot about the climate and want to see action taken. And so let's not put it out any illusion that that's not the case in the NDP base as well. We know that the public cares about climate, and we also know that like most of the energy, like the new really vibrant, like ferocious energy that is coming into the NDP party is because of candidates who are, you know, basically eco-socialists, who are fighting for climate justice, a framework of a Green New Deal. And so, you know, hopefully the NDP is taking note of that, of the people who are actually driving young people and people who care a lot about climate towards their party. And that should only increase over time, and especially in the lead up to an election where a one-time alliance strategy would be in play. I would say that, you know, NDP and Greens are going to be, you know, just vying for that climate vote in a major way, and that's going to be pushing their candidates. And then I would also say that one of the beautiful things about a really people-powered movement in heading into an election is that once those politicians are in place, because of the effort of this like grassroots movement, is then they're in a position where they're accountable to the social movements who elected them to be there. And so just like the Green Party MPs that are in the House of Commons, you know, like these movement oriented MPs like Matthew Green and Laurel Collins and Leah Gazan, is they're really accountable to the people who made sure that they got elected. And that's so important in our political system as we move forward, is like, we need these politicians to know that we put them there and that we expect them to really be swinging for the fence in the House of Commons on climate.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to turn it over to Rolly now, and thanks, Rael. I'm sure Rolly can handle it. We've got 20 open questions there, Rolly. I'm sure you can handle that, man.
Well, we'll be here till about 4, but yes, I can handle that. And I'd like to draw attention, of course, to the thread of discussion in the chat. Katie, when you mentioned the new climate denialism that Seth Klein speaks about in The Good War, there's a whole discussion, you know, about that. So one mentions politics as usual is not okay. Exactly, Katie. I've encountered that several times while campaigning for Angela. And you know, you like your strategy about the Liberals don't have an adequate plan and so on. So if you don't have time to sort of go through the thread, just cut and paste it and you can look at it after, I suppose. So yeah, let's get to some of the questions then. So I'll start off with one of the first questions. It's from Les Schramm. And he says, more and more people, including Seth Klein and Bill Gates, agree that oil and gas production must be drawn down. Seth Klein notes that the NDP governments of Alberta and BC have supported fossil fuel expansion. He also notes that the federal NDP is constrained in its GHG policies by its ties to the provincial parties. So what makes the NDP plan acceptable? And this is a question that sort of comes up repeatedly in one way or another. What makes the NDP plan acceptable to the Greens, which calls for drawing down on oil and gas production and not expansion? So that there's a clash of philosophy there, I suppose. So yeah, Katie, do you want to take that first, and then Rael?
Yeah, I would say it's not acceptable at all. It's absolutely unacceptable. The NDP's position on climate, the target they support should be 60% emissions reductions targets. That is in line with what our fair share would be domestically. That's just domestically we're talking about. And yeah, should be fully in line with how do we phase out fossil fuels. And you know, there have been some big unions that have come out recently and said 60% is what we support. And you know, yeah, just it's not acceptable. We need to be pushing harder on on the NDP to be increasing their emissions reductions targets. And again, like I say, I think if in a position where we have Annamie Paul on side with this kind of a strategy, I think Annamie Paul could wage a very good campaign on Jagmeet Singh to ensure that they can increase their targets. That being said, I do think that the NDP has some really exciting policy that is in line with a Green New Deal. All of it can be pushed further, as I believe it should. But I do believe that they have, at a federal level in particular, policy in line with the Green New Deal, which is not just talking about the percentages of carbon in the atmosphere, but is talking about all of the ways our our social safety net can contribute to reducing emissions, how, all of those things. And I know the Greens are on side with that too. But I think, at a basic level, it's not acceptable. It needs to change. And we need, we need as many people as possible making that call to Jagmeet Singh and the NDP.
Rae, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the only thing I'd like to add is I hope we elect quite a few more Greens as well, because I think that we're really going to need the Greens to put the feet to the fire of the NDP to respect what they've promised on the Green New Deal.
Okay.
I mean, the ideal thing would be if the Green Party could reach official party status. That would be really nice. Unfortunately, that seems to be out of reach unless really there's a popular movement across the country, which substantially increases the vote share of the Greens in the upcoming election.
Rae, do you want to remind us what the official status, official
seats.
Party status would be? Is it 12? Is it 10 or 12?
12 seats, and to get 12 seats, when you get the 12 seats, you get all kinds of additional resources. That's
Right.
what happens. You get more speaking time in Parliament and so on. So it would make a huge difference. But that's a long way to go. They're going from 3 right now. Without an alliance, it's even conceivable the Greens might drop from 3 to 2. So we got work to do.
Thank you, both of you. There are a fair number of practical questions. This one is from Susan Berlin. She says, in Canadian law, is it possible for 2 parties to run a single candidate whose name appears on both party lines on the ballot? She says that's done in New York State and municipal elections, and it's very effective.
I don't know what our Canadian law would say specifically on that. We haven't raised it. We have raised with Elections Canada the possibility that one party can endorse the other. That is allowed. What's not allowed is the movement of resources from one to the other. You can't have the Green Party contributing to the NDP, but you can have Green Party members making voluntary contributions to whichever party they want, wherever they want. So I think that endorsement clause, that's a valuable one. So when if there's a formal agreement that let's say the NDP will not run a candidate in Malpeque, then that should be part of the media, the media package that's put forward, so that people know they're expected to vote Green in order to pursue the joint policy interests of both parties.
Okay, thank you. Tom Cullen asks, Tom has several questions. Thank you, Tom, for the questions. The climate and environment policies of the NDP, we've covered that one. Although there may be differences, between your 2 alliances, it seems peculiar that there are alliances trying to forge one alliance. So I think perhaps you need to clarify what he's asking is, can you not reconcile your differences and make one alliance? So I guess perhaps you need to define or clarify your working relationship that you may have. So Katie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, and I won't speak for too long on this. The long and the short of it is that we are running an election campaign as an official third party in the upcoming election. And so because of Canadian election law, it makes it really disadvantageous to actually work with other organizations on a shared strategy. Basically what happens is, whatever your campaign is, if you're one organization, your budget restrictions are the same as if you're, 2 organizations together working on the same strategy. So it's very disadvantageous, for example, for One Time Alliance folks in 350 Canada to have a shared election campaign strategy. And I'll pass it to Riel because I know you folks don't want to run an election strategy. I would say too that like, again, what Riel was saying earlier is that they're coming from a place of electoral reform, whereas 350 Canada is really like climate is our central motivator for this campaign. So yeah, I think that's where it's a little bit different, but I know that the One Time Alliance folks are like obviously very supportive of this campaign and that the centrality of climate in it.
Yeah, the way that if we wanted to have a single campaign for both organizations, the OTA would simply fold and we'd just tell our people just volunteer for 350 Canada, which is largely what we've done, except we're not doing the folding part because we feel we still have something to contribute. But you know, every time Katie sends out a call for writing a letter to the editor or something like that, I'm sure a lot of the responses you're getting are coming from One Time Alliance people. So I think we can make this work quite easily. Having us as a separate organization does allow us to keep speaking about electoral reform in a more active way than 350 Canada would do. And that's the case, I think, for any organization. Every organization has their particular axe to grind, let's say, to use the wrong expression, but you know what I mean. And so they're not going to give that up.
And you know, I think it's very helpful that there is an organization that is rooted in the Green Party that is doing this work, and that's not 350 Canada. We don't have like rooted affiliations with any one particular party, although I will say there are people in 350 as an organization who have run for both the NDP and the Green Party. So there are people on our team with those like, you know, past political affiliations. But yeah, I think our relationship to each other in this greater movement ecosystem is that we're very much aligned. And yeah, exactly what you're saying, Riel. Like I know you have a member of your organization who's hosting an event with a volunteer with 350 Canada on a climate emergency alliance in the coming weeks. And yeah, we get to, yeah, we are working together. And I think where there's ways we can amplify your work, we're going to do that as well.
Yes, obviously your working relationship is you know, it's not a competition, it's complementary. And I think a lot of the climate organizations work that way. It's the only way to do it, actually. Thank you for your answers. Lynn Adamson asked, and her question deals with action at the ADA level or the riding level. She says, question regarding building support at the ADA level. Has there been any effort to go to the EDAs for the 108 ridings you speak of, and seeing if it's possible to get some interest there? Are volunteers needed to help reach out for this? So it looks like Lynn is, as usual, volunteering for something.
Lynn, you're everywhere. That's so good. Yes. What we've been encouraging people to do is take this to the constituencies that you're connected to. So if you're part of a riding association, take the case document, take One Time Alliance research and bring it up to your membership. How does it apply? Where does your riding lie within the different frameworks that One Time Alliance and 350 have come up with? Yeah, figure out how you want to move this up within your organization. The thing that so we need to, especially as we're going into election, be really careful as 350 as an organization around collusion. So we need to make sure that we're being very clear that we're empowering volunteers to take the information that we've created, that's all on our website, and run with it in the places and in the networks that you run in. So yeah, we really, we have our own strategies that we're going to be pushing out, including the like donor strategy and trying to build more public support for this. And we really also need people who are empowered by this idea to be taking it and running with it.
Do you have anything to add to that, Riel?
Well, it's the same for us.
Yep.
We have only a limited number of volunteers. We have about 140 members in the One Time Alliance, and a lot of them are concentrated in a small number of ridings. So we could use volunteers in other ridings, particularly people who are already involved with their EDAs. Those are the people that can play a critical role. Particularly some of those top green ridings where we could use some collaboration from the NDP. Those are the ones we could really use some help in those ridings.
Thank you for those answers. Evelyn Gigante's questions. How did the Greens come to stand down in the by-election in South Burnaby, which first elected Jagmeet Singh? There seems to be some difficulty in people stepping out of the way to allow the party to run its candidate. So it did happen, of course, in the case of Jagmeet Singh. So how did that come about?
I wonder if that was before the constitutional amendment to run a candidate in every riding, or if National Council, Federal Council simply made an exception in that case. I'm not sure which it was. The Greens had very little to lose in that case. And they wanted to make a statement that they were the party of collaboration, and they did that. I remember that the Green share of the vote was less than 5% there. I think it was in the 3 or 4% range. So it didn't really cost them very much, and they got, I think, some good press out of that. But I'm not sure how they overcame the constitutional requirement. I know it came from Elizabeth May. The lead came from the leader at the time.
Yeah,
so there was,
I'm seeing in the chat that Federal Council made that decision, and that tracks with what I've heard about it as well. Yeah. I want to add too that in Edmonton, Strathcona, I'm just going to paste in an article here about it, but the Green Party candidate in Edmonton, Strathcona that had like quite a bit of volunteer support behind him. I believe he was part of Extinction Rebellion and some other climate organizing groups locally. Actually, when they realized that the stakes were really high in that riding, it could either have gone to Heather McPherson for the NDP or a Conservative candidate. He actually stood down in that riding, and my understanding, and I believe it's covered in this article, is that he was actually kicked out of the Green Party for doing that. And so I think here again is an example of, and this could go either way to either parties, of a situation where we're putting our passion for our party politics ahead of strategy, and it's a problem. And what happened in Edmonton, Strathcona is that and I'm not saying I'm a cheerleader for Heather McPherson in any way, but that's certainly better than having a Conservative representing that riding. So.
Okay, thank you for that. Cecile Wilson asks, what are you suggesting for ridings where the Liberals, have a stranglehold with both Greens and NDP run? So I guess those ridings would not be part of your list of 108. Is that the simple answer? Or?
That's the simple answer, yeah.
Okay.
We want the parties to be able to retain their identities. The ambition that we have, those of us who are involved in the electoral reform movement, would like to see both parties survive. We're not calling for a merger of the two parties. There's value in having two different parties. And therefore, there's value in maintaining a presence in those ridings that wouldn't yield any positive results from collaboration. So really, we're just looking at something where we have collaboration in those ridings where it would make a difference.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just one more thing to add is I think those ridings in particular are important for people to really make sure that it's clear to the public that the Conservatives are terrible on climate, to hound those local Liberal candidates on their climate policy. So anytime there's a debate, anytime they're getting a donation asked from a Liberal campaign, anytime they get to see that Liberal candidate, is to be asking them, what are you doing on climate? You're saying one thing and you're doing another, and to make that as public as possible, because again, what makes those people in power is people voting for them. And so we need to make sure that it's clear for everyone who's seeing that there's a mismatch between action and words.
Thank you. The most recent question at 2:10, is anybody thinking, I mean, as if getting an alliance for the federal election is not enough, but this person, Sanjin Zeko, asked, is anyone thinking about an alliance in Ontario for next year's election? Now there's food for thought.
I have not forgotten that one. I've actually crunched the numbers for Ontario. And the numbers for Ontario are actually way more encouraging for collaboration than they are federally. And the reason is that the parties that would need to collaborate in Ontario, the two main parties are the Liberals and the NDP, which are more or less at the same level. I think we could virtually guarantee that Doug Ford could not win the next election or another majority if the Liberals and the NDP were to collaborate. Now, if you ask me, is that going to happen? I'd have to say I don't think so.
What about the convergence, not the convergence, but the collaboration of the NDP and Greens in Ontario? Is that not along the same, level of possibility that we're seeing federally?
That's right. The Greens are simply not as strong in Ontario. There might be collaboration in a couple of ridings. That's about the best we could really imagine. Let's say 2 for the Greens and 2 for the NDP, so that would be 4. The real collaboration in Ontario would have to be between the Liberals and the NDP. Failing that, there's a very good chance we'll have another Conservative majority in the next election.
Ouch.
But the partisan lines drawn between the NDP and the Liberals are so strong that where I've raised this, I just get shut down right away. I'm fighting. We're fighting enough of a war just federally without starting Ontario as well.
We're just trying to plant the seed. That's all.
Yeah, no, please do that. Maybe it'll grow.
Okay. Let's see. We're at 2:16. I think I've covered a lot of the questions, at least the main theme in a lot of the questions. I just had one more maybe from Liz Couture. She says or asks, do you have evidence that most people look at the local candidate as well as the federal party dynamics? So what do most people look at? The local candidate, or do they look at the dynamics at the federal level, or at least at the writing level to begin with?
Well, I mean, I think at a basic level, we just know this because most people actually aren't part of a political party, like they're not paying members of political parties. So I think that in itself is clear that, a lot of people are looking at local level dynamics, but also within like a federal scenario. In the document, the case document that we outline, we talk a little bit about this in terms of like voter intention, and especially for young people, which is the single largest growing voter bloc in the country. Most young people don't actually have like political affiliations, or like feel like political parties represent them. There's been a really huge culture shift over the past couple of decades around that. Whereas, at one point, like everyone kind of had their party that they were a part of, or like their political affiliation. Whereas, young people today are really looking for like, who is the most inspiring candidate that represents my values, as opposed to, looking at the parties necessarily. And so, and I think we see that at a riding level, where we have these amazing upticks of volunteer engagement, especially with young people behind candidates that are really inspiring and bold. You clearly see where the energy for either party is coming from because of that. So if you look more at the case document, which is at climatealliance.ca/case, there's more you can dig into on that in particular.
Thank you. So Ken, I think I'll turn it back to you. The comments keep coming in the chat, so there's a very interesting discussion going on there. But I'll turn it back to you and to Kathleen. And thank you very much, Katie and Rial, for answering the questions which I directed to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rolly. I'll turn it back over to Kathleen to talk about next week and actions for this week. Kathleen?
Thank you. And again, thank you to our guests. It's been wonderful. Ken, do you have the slide for next week?
Yeah, I'm trying to put it up.
Okay. So I think we couldn't have planned it better if we'd tried, because you've both pointed out that the Liberals somehow have Canadians fooled that they're green and they're advanced and they're doing well. I think Biden is helping to cast a bit of a shadow over that. But so next week's guest is the journalist Martin Lukash, and he's written a book called The Trudeau Formula. And he starts out with the whole con job of Sunny Ways and how smooth the Liberals looked and how much better they looked than Harper. And he basically points out that a lot of it is communications strategy, that they sound nicer, but they managed to get a pipeline in where Harper couldn't have got a pipeline in or would have had more trouble, a lot more pushback. So it's a wonderful read. And if you don't have time to read it in the next week, either way, come and listen to Martin go over his book. And we look forward to everyone coming. I just wanted to say to Ken and Rolly, have we got all the links up for Katie and Rael?
Yes, I did. And I think today
Okay.
Katie put up some of her own links as well. Plus, of course, we're going to have all of these links as well in the follow-up email, along with a link to the video for the actual webinar. So yeah,
yes,
we've got them all.
So on my, oh yes, Rael?
I'd just like to ask before before it's too late, I'd really like a copy of the chat if I could have one. And I would also, in terms of the links, it's really easy in our case with the One Time Alliance. It's onetimealliance.ca. So One Time Alliance is one word, .ca. And then there's a tab in there called Key Links. And then you can get all of our resource documents are under Key Links.
Okay. Well, again, thank you both.
I've got Zoomed again. I cannot get to screen share for some reason. I've got a new computer and it's all sitting there waiting, but it won't let me in. So sorry. One more Zoom crutch.
Well, really appreciate this conversation, and yeah, can't wait to work with everyone who's been watching and making sure that we elect some Green New Deal champions.
Rael, would you like to say anything? Final comment?
I just want to say this has been a great pleasure for me. I'm sorry about my dog. It's because someone's knocking at the door. I can't mute myself and talk at the same time. Doesn't work. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed the questions. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I wanted to point out that also, I think it's 350 has just opened up conversations you're trying to have over the next week or two across the country. So we're honored to be probably one of the first ones.
Yes. Yeah, so if you go to climatealliance.ca/101-101F, if you are really compelled by this idea and want to host conversations, you can either host public or private events online. And we have the slide deck and speaking notes. So you can basically, have a conversation like we just had today, but with people that might not already know about this idea. And so, if that's something that you want to do, go to that website and sign up. And I'm the one who's supporting people to do these events. So would love to support you to pull one of those events off or more.
Katie, I wanted to point out that you may already know, but the viewers who mostly know is this conversation will be put up on YouTube in the next day or two and will be accessible to anyone. So we send out a link to that for everyone who registered, and we'll send it to you. Read it as you wish. I'd just like to read one last very short comment. Little to lose. What is remarkable about any of the above scenarios is how very little either party has to lose by cooperating with the others in terms of overall competitiveness, because there are very few ridings in the country in which the NDP and the Greens are primary rivals in the same riding. I think the Rael's documents point out there's just 3 of them on Vancouver Island, and just let them compete. But for so many other places, you're just banging your head against the wall in a place where you're vote splitting. I mean, the Conservatives had done it in Alberta. The Wild Rose Party came, and then they said, we better merge or we're going to be in trouble. The federal Conservatives did it, and then Harper got in. So this is not strange to Canadian politics, and it makes so much sense. So thank you so much for a very compelling hour and a quarter. And I hope our viewers are going away with a lot more information and a lot more compelled about the value of this. We have a climate emergency. It keeps coming back to that. And it's just unbelievable how partisan politics gets in the way.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much. Any last word, Kathleen or Rolly?
Well, just thank you very much to Katie and to Rael, whom I'm meeting for the first time. Nice to meet you, Rael.
And ditto on that. It is a climate emergency and they'd better start acting like it. Our politicians, our leaders. So we'll have to help them. Thanks.
Anyway, I'd like to thank everyone who tuned in, and most of them are still with us at 2:18 or 2:20, 2:25. So we'll end it there and look forward to next week. Mark Lukacs has an amazing analysis that's valuable for this conversation as well. Okay, thank you. Hopefully we see you next week. Bye for now.